welcome back to the Cineflux. I'm your host, and I'm so grateful you have carved out a moment of your day to be here. If you have been with us for a while, you know that in this space, we don't just consume cinema, we let it wash over us. We look for the brushstrokes, we feel the weight of every frame and the truth of every silence. Today, I want to talk to you about a film that demands nothing less than your entire unbroken presence. So, take a slow breath, silence the noise of the world around you, and let's step into the dark together. Imagine a single dust mote suspended in a shaft of pale artificial light. It doesn't fall, it drifts, caught in a thermal we cannot feel, dancing in a space where time seems to have surrendered its authority. Now hold that image. Hold the feeling it gives you. That quiet suspension between one thing and another, between who you were and who you are becoming, between the love that is safe and the love that terrifies you completely, because that is exactly the emotional space that Love Me lives inside. Not the dramatic clash of two hearts colliding, not the triumphant swell of a love story resolved, but the long, aching, luminous moment of not knowing, and the way that not knowing can feel somehow more alive than any certainty ever could. There is something this film understands that very few romantic dramas bother to explore. It understands that grief and desire do not operate in separate rooms, they share the same hallway. They pass each other in the dark. And when a young woman is carrying the weight of a brother she has lost, the question of who she chooses to love is never really just about love. It is about survival. It is about what shape the rest of her life will take. It is about whether she trusts herself enough to feel something real when feeling something real has already cost her everything once before. That is the soul of this film. And before we go any further, I want you to sit with that for just a moment. Because Love Me is a film that rewards that kind of attention. So let me introduce it to you properly. Love Me arrived on Amazon Prime Video on February 13, 2026, the eve of Valentine's Day, which tells you something immediately about the confidence and the intent behind its release. The film was directed by Roger Corman, an American filmmaker perhaps best known to cinephiles as the man who gave us Cruel Intentions back in 1999, a film that itself understood the dangerous electricity between beauty, desire, and the cruelty that can live inside both. That Campbell would return more than 2 decades later to a story built on youth, longing, and the masks we wear in places where everyone is watching. That feels less like coincidence and more like a filmmaker returning to a frequency he never quite left behind. The screenplay was written by Veronica Galli and Serena Tete, adapting the first book in a four-part series by the Italian author known as Stefania S., a novel that began its life on Wattpad and accumulated over 24 million reads before anyone in a production office had even noticed it. Think about what that number means. 24 million readers finding this story on their phones, in their beds, in stolen moments between the demands of their own lives, choosing to return to it again and again. That is not an audience that was manufactured. That is a hunger that already existed long before the cameras rolled. The film is produced by Italy's Leone Group alongside Amazon MGM Studios in collaboration with Webtoon Productions. It was shot on location in Milan, with the magnificent Villa Mondragone serving as the physical shell of the elite international school at the story center, a real place of extraordinary architectural presence, its old world grandeur providing a quietly ironic backdrop for the very modern, very raw emotional chaos that erupts within its walls. The cast is as international as the school it portrays. Mia Jenkins, a young British actress who audiences may recognize from the series Geek Girl, plays June, our protagonist, our anchor, our way in. Opposite her, the Spanish actor Pepe Barroso Silva brings James to life, a performance that carries a particular kind of coiled energy, the kind that makes you lean forward in your seat without quite knowing why. And the Italian actor Luca Melucci plays Will, steady, golden, seemingly everything a person could want, and perhaps, for exactly that reason, somehow not quite enough. What world does this film inhabit? On its surface, it inhabits the familiar territory of young adult romance, the elite school, the love triangle, the push and pull of attraction between people who probably shouldn't be drawn to each other but cannot help themselves. But underneath the surface, this film inhabits something a little more complex. It inhabits the world of a young woman who is genuinely broken, not theatrically broken, not conveniently broken for narrative purposes, but quietly, persistently broken by a loss so specific and so personal that every decision she makes carries its shadow. And that is what elevates Love Me above the genre shelf it would be easy to place it on. Should you watch this film? Here is what I will say. If you have ever stood at a crossroads between what feels safe and what feels true, this film has something to say to you. If you have ever loved someone and felt the terror of that love, the way it opens you up to damage as much as it opens you up to joy, this film will find you in that place. It is not a perfect film. I will be honest with you about where it falls short. But it is a film with genuine feeling at its center, and in a landscape of stories that often mistake spectacle for emotion that matters more than it might seem. Now, let me tell you what it felt like to actually sit with this film for the first time. When I first sat with Love Me, I will be honest, I came in with a particular set of expectations. The Wattpad origin, the Valentine's Day release, the genre trappings of a love triangle set in an elite school, all of it pointed toward a certain kind of experience. Warm, entertaining, emotionally competent but not emotionally challenging, the kind of film you enjoy genuinely and then release gently back into the world when it's over. I was prepared for that. I was almost comfortable with that, and then the film opened. What the opening sequence does, almost without announcing itself, is establish grief as a physical presence, not grief as a narrative device, not grief as backstory to be mentioned and then set aside, but grief as something that occupies the same space as June herself. You feel it in the way she moves through the first frames, in the careful, measured way she carries herself, as though some part of her is still holding herself together with both hands and cannot afford to let go. Mae Jenkins does something extraordinarily subtle in these early moments. She plays loss not as sadness but as a kind of heightened brittle watchfulness. June is paying attention to everything around her because everything around her is new and potentially dangerous, and underneath that watchfulness is someone who has already learned that the world can take things from you without warning. Milan opens around her like a painting. And this is where the film does something I genuinely did not expect. Rather than letting the city's beauty function as simple aesthetic decoration, Campbell and his cinematographer use it almost as a form of emotional pressure. The beauty of Milan. The light on old stone, the way a piazza holds silence differently from a London street, the luminous quality of northern Italian afternoon. All of it is rendered in that pop fluorescent sensory saturated visual language the producer spoke about, and it creates a specific kind of loneliness. Because when the world is that beautiful and you are standing inside your grave, the beauty doesn't comfort you, it isolates you. It makes the distance between where you are and where you feel like you belong even more visible. I did not expect to feel that on first viewing. I expected beauty as backdrop. What I encountered was beauty as emotional counterpoint. That was the moment I sat up slightly straighter and paid a different kind of attention. The school arrives, and with it comes the structure of the world. June is entering hierarchies she doesn't yet understand, friendships that carry histories she isn't privy to, and the first collision with two young men who will come to define the next chapter of her story. When Will appears, the film plays the moment with exactly the warmth you'd expect. Gentle, reassuring, the suggestion of safety. When James appears, the film plays it differently. There is no warmth in that first encounter, there is friction. There is the specific discomfort of being seen by someone when you have been working very hard not to be seen. And what Campbell understands, what he communicates through framing and the careful management of screen distance, is that discomfort and attention are not the same thing as threat. Sometimes they are the very first language of recognition. The atmosphere the film creates in those opening minutes is something I keep returning to. It is the atmosphere of arrival, not the triumphant cinematic arrival of a protagonist who knows who she is and where she is going, but the fragile, uncertain arrival of someone who is hoping that a new place might teach her something about herself that the old place no longer can. It is a quieter kind of hope than romance films usually deal in, and it caught me entirely off guard. Now let me walk you through the story itself, not as a sequence of events, but as a journey. Because in the end, that is what Love Me is really offering you. June arrives in Milan carrying the kind of weight that has no visible shape. Her brother is gone. The life she had before is gone with him. And what Milan represents for her is not so much a fresh start. That phrase is too optimistic, too clean for what she is actually experiencing, as it is a place where the weight might, for brief moments, become slightly less impossible to carry. A place where no one knows who she was before. A place where she can construct a version of herself that is still standing. The elite international school she enters is a word unto itself, Villa Mondragon, with its sweeping corridors and its centuries of accumulated elegance, becomes a kind of stage. A place where performance is not optional, where every student is playing some version of who they want the others to believe they are. This is the film's cleverest structural choice because it places June's authentic brokenness in direct collision with a world built entirely on curated surfaces. She cannot quite manage the performance that everyone around her seems to manage so effortlessly. And that inability, that raw, unpolished visibility, is what makes her interesting to the people who matter most in this story, who finds her first, in the way that warmth always finds the coal. He is everything the setting would produce, accomplished, generous, the kind of beautiful that doesn't seem to know it's beautiful, which is of course its own kind of power. The film is careful here, and I think this carefulness is one of its genuine strengths. Will is not a villain. He is not a placeholder. He is not wrong for June in any obvious or dramatic sense. He is in many ways exactly right for her. Kind in the way she needs kindness, steady in the way she needs steadiness, and the film allows that to be true. It allows the audience to feel the genuine comfort of what Will offers, because only then does the complication of James make its full emotional weight felt. James arrives like weather. He does not introduce himself so much as he interrupts. And what the film communicates about him in those early encounters is not danger in any simple sense. It is a kind of radical honesty that June cannot quite protect herself against. Where Will meets her, where she is, James sees where she actually is, underneath where she is. He does not offer comfort. He offers something more unsettling and, for a person in June's particular kind of pain, something potentially more necessary. He offers recognition. The love triangle the film constructs is familiar in its architecture and genuinely involving in its execution. The pacing in the first act is assured, scenes build on each other with real momentum. Relationships develop through specific moments of contact rather than simply declared through dialogue, and the emotional stakes accumulate with the kind of quiet inevitability that good storytelling produces. You begin to understand not just who these characters are, but why they are the way they are, and that why is where the film's emotional intelligence lives. As June moves deeper into her life in Milan, as her relationships with both Will and James grow in complexity and mutual dependency, the film begins to layer in the secrets the premise promises. Nothing at this school is as it appears on its gleaming surface. Motivations run deeper than they seem. Histories intersect in ways that June, as the new arrival, is the last to understand. And watching her navigate that, with her grief still quietly present beneath everything, with her watchfulness both protecting her and isolating her, creates a kind of dramatic tension that operates on two levels simultaneously. There is the external tension of the plot's unfolding mysteries, and there is the internal tension of a young woman trying to figure out whether she trusts herself enough to feel what she is clearly beginning to feel. The film builds toward a moment, a shift in the narrative's center of gravity that changes the terms of everything that has come before it. And here is where the film shifts completely. But that is where I want to pause for now. Because to go further into what happens in that shift is to enter territory that deserves its own conversation, its own space, its own care. And before we get there, I want to talk to you about how this film was made, what it achieved, and what it fell short of, because the craft of this film is worth your attention in its own right. Let's begin with the performances. Because in a film like this, a film that lives or dies on the emotional credibility of its central relationships, performance is not simply one element among many. It is the entire foundation. If the actors don't make you believe, nothing else the film does matters. And here is the thing about Love Me that I think gets lost in the noise of how it was received. The performances at their best are considerably better than the film around them deserves. Mia Jenkins, as June, carries the film on her shoulders with a quiet, almost architectural composure. What strikes me most about her work here is what she chooses not to do. In lesser hands, a character defined by grief and displacement might become an exercise in visible suffering. The trembling lip, the distant gaze, the performed sadness that asks for sympathy without earning intimacy. Jenkins does none of that. Her June is closed in the way that genuinely wounded people are closed, not dramatically, not cinematically, but in the specific, everyday, functional way that people learn to be when they have discovered that openness costs too much. She holds herself carefully. She processes emotions slightly behind the moment, as though she needs a half second more than everyone else to decide how much of what she's feeling she's willing to let out. It is a remarkably controlled and remarkably felt performance, and it anchors the film at every point where the script might otherwise let it drift. The scene that proves it most completely, the one I keep returning to when I think about what Jenkins does here, is a quieter scene, not the big dramatic moment the film builds toward. It is an early scene in which June is alone in her new room in this beautiful city, surrounded by evidence of the life she is supposed to be constructing, and she simply sits. She doesn't cry, she doesn't speak. She just sits with the specific quality of absence that people carry when they are missing someone who isn't coming back. It lasts perhaps 40 seconds, and in those 40 seconds, Jenkins communicates everything the film's first act needs you to feel. The whole emotional architecture of Joan's story is contained in that single, understated moment. That is the work of a genuinely gifted young actor, and it deserves to be named. Pepe Barroso Silva as James has the more traditionally difficult assignment. The dangerous, charismatic love interest with a hidden depth and a dangerous secret is one of the most exhausted figures in young adult romance, and the risk of that role is always the same. Play the danger too hard and the character becomes a cartoon. Play the softness too early and the tension collapses. Barroso Silva finds a particular quality in James that I think saves the character from both of those traps. He plays him as someone who is genuinely not performing. In a school full of carefully constructed surfaces, James is the one person who seems to have given up on the performance entirely, not because he is enlightened, but because he is tired. There is an exhaustion underneath his defiance that makes him sympathetic without softening his edges. And in his scenes with Jenkins, there is a specific chemistry, not the warm, comfortable chemistry of compatible personalities, but the uncomfortable, slightly disorienting chemistry of two people who recognize something in each other that neither of them wanted to be recognized. Luca Melucci's will is perhaps the most underwritten of the three central figures, and that is a failing of the script more than of the performance. But Melucci does something genuinely thoughtful with the material he is given. He resists the temptation to play Will as naive or oblivious, choices that would make the character easier to dismiss and would make Jones' eventual pull toward James easier to justify from a moral standpoint. Instead, he plays Will as someone who sees more than he lets on and chooses, for reasons that are entirely human and entirely understandable, to keep seeing less. That is a harder, more interesting choice, and it makes the film's emotional triangle genuinely triangular. 3 points of feather weight rather than the two against one configuration that lesser versions of this story would settle for. Now let's talk about the writing, because this is where the film's intelligence and its limitations become most visible in the same breath. What Veronica Gali and Serena Tateo achieve in their screenplay is something genuinely worth examining. They understand that the most emotionally interesting version of this story is not the love triangle itself, but the question that the love triangle is really asking. And the question it is really asking is this: when you are in the process of rebuilding yourself after loss, is it safer to build toward what feels comfortable or toward what feels true? That is a real question. That is a question that resonates far beyond the specific architecture of a teen romance, and the fact that the screenplay keeps returning to. Not always explicitly, sometimes just in the texture of how scenes are constructed, gives the film a thematic consistency that elevates it above pure genre exercise. There are scenes and exchanges in this screenplay that reveal its intelligence in specific, concrete ways. A conversation between June and James, set in one of Milan's quieter corners, in which they are ostensibly talking about something entirely mundane, but in which everything they are actually communicating about is grief and the specific way grief makes you distrust your own emotions. That scene is genuinely well written. It earns its beats. It lets the subtext do the work that lesser writing would make explicit, and it produces an emotional effect that lands with the quiet precision of a truth spoken in a sideways voice. What the writing misfurnace, and I will be fair about this because it matters, is depth of interiority. The source material, as readers of Stefania Samya's novel will know, derives enormous emotional power from the internal voices of its characters, from the specific texture of June's thoughts as she processes everything that is happening to her. That interiority is by necessity harder to render on screen than on the page, but the screenplay doesn't always find equivalent cinematic strategies for it. There are moments where you want to understand what June is actually thinking, not just what she is choosing to do, and the film doesn't quite reach far enough inside her to show you. The result is that her emotional arc, while credible, is occasionally less fully inhabited than it deserves to be. Moving now to the visual language of the film, and this is where I want to spend some real time because Roger Comble and his collaborators have made genuine choices here that deserve genuine attention. The pop fluorescent cinematography that the producers describe when speaking about a film is not mere aesthetic branding. It is a specific visual philosophy with an emotional argument behind it. The heightened saturation of the film's color palette, the way Milan seems to glow slightly beyond what reality would allow, the way interiors burn with a warmth that is just one shade too vivid, creates a visual register that is simultaneously beautiful and slightly unstable. It is the visual equivalent of how emotions feel when you are young and in the grip of something you don't fully understand yet, not quite real, slightly too much, luminous in a way that might be wonder or might be wounding, and you cannot yet tell which. The shots that stay with me are specific. There is a framing used more than once in which June is positioned in the middle ground of a wide shot, with the architectural grandeur of Villa Mondragon filling the frame behind her, while the human activity of school life moves around her in soft focus. It is a shot that communicates isolation through geometry. She is present, she is surrounded, and she is profoundly alone in the middle of all of it. That is a shot that is working. That is a director using space and composition to say something that no line of dialogue could say as precisely. There is also a recurring visual motif involving light through glass. Windows, doorways, archways through which light passes and is broken into fragments before it reaches June. It is not an accidental choice. Glass is a barrier that admits light but not warmth, visibility but not contact. And the film's repeated use of that filtered, fragmented light around June is a visual articulation of her emotional state. She can see the warmth, she can feel its direction, but something between her and it keeps breaking it apart before it can reach her fully. And then there are the close ups. Comble uses extreme close ups of faces during emotional inflection points, not the held, studied close up of old fashioned melodrama, but quick, breathless, almost stolen close ups that feel like the camera catching something it wasn't meant to see. Jenkins, in particular, is served brilliantly by this choice. There are moments when the camera finds her face at exactly the instant that some emotion she has been managing slips very briefly into visibility, and those moments are among the most cinematically alive in the entire film. Now, the score and the sound design. Because this film's musical identity is something worth exploring carefully. The soundtrack of Love Me, Love Me, Love Me operates in a mode that is characteristic of contemporary streaming romance, curated, emotionally intelligent, pop adjacent but with enough sophistication to avoid the obvious. What the music does well in this film is enter quietly and exit carefully. It doesn't announce itself at emotional moments the way lesser films use music as emotional instruction, as a signal to the audience about how to feel. Instead, it creates a kind of tonal weather. It establishes atmosphere rather than directing response, and that restraint is a genuine virtue. There are sequences in this film where the score withdraws entirely and leaves the emotional weight to the actors, to the ambient sound of Milan, footsteps on old stone, the specific murmur of a city that has been alive for centuries and will remain alive long after every emotion being felt within it has passed. Those moments of scored silence are among the most affecting in the film, because silence used this way is not absence, it is presence of a different kind. It is the film trusting the emotional intelligence of its audience enough not to tell them what to feel. The sound design in the underground MMA sequences deserves particular mention. The clandestine fights that constitute James's hidden life are rendered with a specific sonic brutality, not the stylized, choreographed sound of action cinema, but something rawer and less elegant, something that communicates damage rather than excitement. The sound of those scenes is doing real thematic work. It is telling you, through physical sensation rather than narrative information, why this world is dangerous for James and why his presence in it means something about who he is and what he is running from. Taken together, performance, writing, visual language, sound, what the craft of Love Me constructs is a film that is more carefully made than it is often credited for being. It is not a film without flaws, let me be clear about that. But it is a film in which genuine creative intelligence is present in its construction, and that intelligence deserves to be seen before we talk about where the film falls short of it. So let's talk about that now. Let's be honest. The most significant weakness of Love Me is a pacing problem that is most acutely felt in its second act. There is a stretch, roughly in the middle of the film's 99-minute runtime, where the narrative loses forward momentum without gaining emotional depth in its place. The story circles back through already established emotional territory without deepening it, and the result is a section of the film that feels, in the most precise sense of the word, redundant, not painful to watch, not offensive, simply insufficiently necessary. And in a film that is running under 2 hours, that is a wound worth naming, because every minute that is not earning its place is a minute that is leaching tension from the minutes around it. The second significant weakness is the underwriting of Will as a character. I touched on this when discussing Miluti's performance, but it is worth examining as a structural problem in its own right. The love triangle this film depends upon for its dramatic engine requires 3 points of genuine weight. And while June and James are rendered with enough specificity and enough contradiction to feel like real people, Will is rendered primarily in relation to what he provides for June and what he means in contrast to James. He exists in the screenplay's construction more as a function than as a person. He is the safety option, he is the alternative, and that is not quite enough to make the choice June eventually faces feel as difficult as the film needs it to feel. When a love triangle resolves, its power comes from the sense that both paths were genuinely possible, genuinely valuable, genuinely costly to abandon. The film earns that for June's relationship with James. It does not quite earn it for her relationship with Will. And that gap, that missing third of the triangle's weight, is the film's deepest structural limitation. There are also moments of tonal inconsistency, places where the film's more grounded emotional register is interrupted by plot mechanics that belong to a slightly different, slightly more heightened version of this story. The secrets, when they arrive, occasionally feel like they have arrived from a film that is operating at a different register than the one that June's quieter grief-based story has been building. It is not a fatal problem, but it is a seam that is occasionally visible, and seams that are visible pull you slightly out of the world the film has been carefully constructing, and even a slight distance in a story that depends on emotional immersion carries a cost. Finally, and this is the smallest of the weaknesses I want to name, the accent and linguistic texture of the cast creates, at moments, a quality of disconnection that no amount of thematic justification can entirely smooth over. The producers made a deliberate choice to have all the characters speak English while retaining their natural accents as a representation of the school's genuine internationalism. That is a defensible artistic choice, and there is something genuinely interesting in the way it creates a multilingual, multicultural texture. But in practice, in certain emotional scenes, the rhythmic unevenness of dialogue delivery across very different English accents disrupts the flow of a scene at precisely the moment when you most need to be inside it. It is a minor wound, but it is a recurring one. These flaws matter. They are not decorative, they represent places where the film did not quite reach what it was capable of reaching. But here is what I want you to hold on to as we move forward. They are the flaws of a film with genuine ambition, not the flaws of a film that was not trying. And that distinction between failing to reach something worth reaching and never reaching for anything at all is meaningful. Now, let me tell you how this film came to exist. The origin of Love Me begins not in a studio boardroom but on a phone screen. In the countless small hours when readers opened Wattpad and found themselves inside Stefania's story and could not quite put it down. The novel, the first in a four-book saga, accumulated over 24 million reads on the platform. That number, as I said earlier, is not manufactured appetite. It is documented hunger, and it is the kind of hunger that, when it reaches the attention of the right people, becomes a film. ATLS Leonlieu Group, the production company behind the project, recognized in Stefania's series not just a popular property but a specific emotional territory that had been left underserved by mainstream Italian cinema. The young adult romance genre, when set in Italy, has tended to lean heavily on the country's visual identity, the beauty, the history, the particular quality of Italian light, while treating its young characters as genre types rather than as specific complicated human beings. Leon Roop, in collaboration with Amazon MGM Studios and Webtoon Productions, saw an opportunity to do something different, and their decision to bring in Roger Campbell as director was, in retrospect, a genuinely interesting creative choice. Campbell, as I mentioned, made Cruel Intentions in 1999, and that film, whatever else it was, understood something important about the way that desire and power intersect in the world of elite youth. Is returned to that world 27 years later with a story that replaces the original cynicism with something warmer and more searching, has a biographical quality to it. As if Kumbal were revisiting a question he asked himself as a younger filmmaker and finding in the intervening decades that he has a different kind of answer. The casting process navigated a genuinely unusual challenge, assembling a cast that could be credibly international while also carrying the emotional weight the story demands. Mia Jenkins was cast as June partly on the strength of her work in Geek Girl, where she demonstrated an ability to play emotional complexity within a lighter register without letting the lightness overwhelm the complexity. Pepereso Silva, fresh from his work on the large-scale production Those About to Die, brought a physicality and an intensity to James that the role genuinely needed, because James's underground MMA life is not just a narrative detail but an expression of his interior, and an actor who couldn't render that physical world convincingly couldn't render the character convincingly. And Luca Milucci as the local Italian presence within an international cast grounds the Milan setting in something real. He is not a visitor to this world, he belongs to it, and that belonging communicates itself through every scene in a way that no amount of location shooting could fully substitute for. It is something I find genuinely fascinating about the production, the decision to film at Villa Mondragone, a real historically significant villa in the Castelli Romani hills near Rome, historically connected to the Renaissance and to centuries of Italian power and culture, rather than constructing a purpose built school environment. The production team chose a real place over a constructed one, and that choice carries consequences for how the film feels. There is a weight to those walls that a set cannot reproduce. When the characters move through those corridors, they are moving through actual history, actual time, actual accumulated human experience, and that weight, invisible but present, unremarked upon but felt, gives the film's emotional events a quality of permanence that they might not have possessed in a more obviously artificial environment. Another fascinating dimension of the production is the deliberate international casting philosophy. The decision not to iron out accents, not to impose linguistic uniformity, but to let the characters speak English in their own voices, from their own mouths, with their own histories audible beneath the common language they share. Nicoletta Leone, the producer, discreetly as a choice about respecting the ethnicities of the cast. As a creative philosophy, it is admirable. It reflects a genuine commitment to representing the actual texture of international youth culture where shared languages are spoken in a dozen different registers simultaneously. The fact that this choice occasionally creates friction in the film's emotional delivery is a real tension, the kind of tension that emerges when an admirable intention meets the unforgiving demands of screen performance. And it is a tension worth noting precisely because it is the product of creative courage, not creative carelessness. The cinematography, that pop fluorescent visual language I described earlier, was a deliberate departure from the more naturalistic Italian visual tradition. The decision to push the color palette into something slightly heightened, slightly beyond realism, was articulated by the producers as a choice to reflect the emotional nuances of the novel. What that means in practice is that the film looks like how it feels to be 17, and in love and over when everyone's likely to rivet slightly too much, beauty arriving with an intensity that is also in its own way a form of pressure. And one final piece of the production story that I want to share with you because it reshapes how I watch a specific dimension of the film, Love Me, is the first installment of a four-book series that Leone Group has optioned in its entirety. This film is, structurally speaking, a beginning. The creative team knew as they were making it that they were establishing a world other than concluding one. The hope articulated openly by the producers was that this film would perform well enough to enable the full story to be told, and acknowledged that this is a world built to be revisited, explains something about the film's final emotional register. It ends not with full resolution, but with the beginning of honesty. Two people no longer hiding from what they are to each other, stepping toward rather than away. It is the ending of a chapter, not a story, and knowing that the chapters exist waiting to be told changes how you hold the incompleteness of where this one ends. Now let's talk about how the world received this film. Because the reception of Love Me is itself a story worth telling, a story about the gap between what audiences expect and what a film actually delivers, about the difference between critical distance and emotional proximity, and about the particular way that stories born on platforms like Wattpad carry a pre-existing relationship with their audience that no film can ever satisfy or fully escape. Love Me arrived on Amazon Prime Video on February 13, 2026, a Thursday, the eve of Valentine's Day, and its release strategy was as deliberate as its timing. This was not a film pushed toward theatrical audiences and then migrated to streaming as an afterthought. It was conceived as a global streaming event, a film built for Prime Video's international reach, designed to arrive in living rooms and on phone screens and on laptops all over the world on the same night, with the particular quality of simultaneous shared experience that streaming premieres at their best can still produce. And in that sense, the strategy worked. The film arrived. People watched it. People talked about it. The conversation it generated was, to put it plainly, divided. And the nature of that division is interesting. On the critical side, the response was measured but not dismissive. those reviewers who engaged with the film on its own terms, as a YA romance with genuine emotional ambitions, not as a prestige drama that had wandered into the wrong genre, tended to find real merit in it. The production values were acknowledged. The cinematography was singled out. Mia Jenkins received consistent praise. The Milan setting was recognized as genuinely well used, with the city functioning as more than decoration. The consensus among sympathetic critics was something like a film that is better than its genre reputation would suggest, imperfect but alive, carried by a central performance that deserves more than the category the film has been placed in. Among less sympathetic reviewers, the criticisms were consistent and, in some cases, genuinely fair. The pacing problems I described earlier were widely noted. The tonal inconsistencies were identified, and the comparison to its source material, inevitable for any adaptation of a beloved property, was not always flattering. Readers of Stefania's novel were in many instances the film's most vocal critics, and what they pointed toward was something specific and worth taking seriously: the loss of interiority, the loss of the inner life of these characters that the novel renders with such care and such specificity. June's walls, in the novel, are not just a fact of her character. They are a texture, a quality of thought, a way of processing the world that the reader is granted intimate access to. James's contradictions in the novel are not just visible in his behavior, they are explained from the inside in a way that makes them comprehensible and therefore devastating. The film, by the nature of its medium and at times by the nature of its screenplay choices, loses significant portions of that interior life, and for the readers who came to the film carrying the novel's intimacy with them, that loss was not a minor disappointment. It was a genuine wound. The audience response on broader platforms was a study in contrasts. On one side, a passionate and genuinely enthusiastic response from viewers who came to the film without the novel's expectations, viewers who found in it exactly what they were looking for, who responded to the chemistry between Jenkins and Barroso Silva, who fell for Milan, who felt the emotional arc of June's journey with real investment, who stayed through the credits and immediately wanted more. On the other side, a vocal contingent of novel readers who felt that the adaptation had traded depth for surface, substance for style, and had produced a film that was aesthetically accomplished but emotionally diminished compared to what the source material had achieved. Both responses are legitimate, both responses are honest, and what they reveal, taken together, is something important about the particular challenge of adapting beloved online fiction, fiction that has built its relationship with its readers through intimacy, through interiority, through the specific experience of reading alone and feeling accompanied. A film cannot replicate that experience. Film is a different art form with different tools and different possibilities. The question is not whether it recreates what the novel did, but whether it does something equivalent, whether it finds the cinematic language for the emotional truth that the novel carried in its literary language. And the honest answer, with Love Me, is that it partially succeeds. It finds that language sometimes brilliantly, and sometimes it doesn't find it at all, and the audience division reflects exactly that partiality. In terms of its streaming life, its second wave existence beyond the initial Valentine's Day premiere, the film has done what the best streaming releases do when they are given time and word of mouth to find their audience. It has accumulated. Viewers who missed the premiere found it in the weeks that followed. Social media conversation around the central relationship, and particularly around Pepe Barroso Silva's performance as James, generated consistent engagement that kept the film visible in algorithmic recommendation cycles. The kind of audience that discovers a film 3 weeks after its release and then watches it twice in the same weekend, which is the most devoted and most influential audience a streaming film can cultivate, appears to have found Love Me in significant numbers. On the awards front, the film's positioning as a streaming wire romance places it largely outside the conventional prestige circuit. The categories that might have recognized its genuine craft contributions, cinematography, late performance, original score, are categories that tend to look elsewhere when the film in question is distributed as Valentine's Day content on a subscription platform. That is a structural reality of how the industry currently functions, and it is worth naming as an injustice, even a minor one, because Mia Jenkins's performance in this film is better than the awards landscape it has been afforded would suggest. What the film has won and what it deserves to be recognized for is the kind of audience loyalty that cannot be manufactured, the kind that emerges when a film genuinely connects with the people it was made for in the way it was made to connect. And that brings me to something I want to address now because it is relevant to everything that comes next. Love Me. Love Me is the first film in a series, not a sequel in the conventional sense, not a continuation that requires the first film to have been a hit before it can be greenlit, but a serialized adaptation of a four-book saga that was optioned in its entirety. Leonie Group and Amazon MGM Studios went into this film knowing that the story does not end here. Knowing that June's journey, James's contradictions, and all the unresolved questions this film deliberately leaves open are the beginning of something larger, not the entirety of something contained. Understanding this changes how the film sits in the broader landscape of its own franchise, if we can call it that at this early stage. Where does Love Me stand in relation to the world it is establishing? It stands exactly where a first installment should stand, as an act of world building, of character establishment, of emotional foundation laying. Its job is not to resolve. Its job is to make you care enough about these people and this world that when the story continues, you will follow it and measured against that specific standard. Not against the standard of a self contained film, but against the standard of a genuinely effective opening chapter. It succeeds more fully than its mixed critical reception might suggest. What does it add to the larger conversation? For that question to be answerable, we need to wait for the chapters that follow. But what it establishes with real confidence is the emotional grammar of this world, the specific way that June processes experience, the specific way that James communicates in friction and refusal, the specific tension between safety and truth that will presumably drive the full four-book arc to whatever resolution Stefania S. has built for these characters. That grammar, once established, once felt, is what gives a serialized story its continuity across multiple installments. And Love Me establishes it clearly enough that when the second film arrives, we will know immediately where we are and why we care. How does it shape what comes next? By leaving questions open rather than closing them. By ending in the space of beginning rather than the space of conclusion. The film's final register. Two people turning toward honesty rather than away from it. The suggestion of something real about to begin rather than something dramatic being resolved is not an incomplete ending. It is a structural choice. It is the ending of a first chapter calibrated to make the second chapter feel necessary. And in the context of a four-book adaptation, that is exactly the right calibration. Now I want to move into the territory that I find most interesting, the territory beneath the story's surface. What is Love Me really about? Not what happens in it, not who chooses whom and why, but what is it actually saying about the human experience that makes it worth your time and your genuine attention? Here is what this film understands. It understands that grief is not a chapter that ends. It is a condition that changes. After loss, real loss, the loss of someone who was not supposed to go yet, who left a specific and irreplaceable shape in the space of your life, you do not recover in the way the word recovery implies. You do not return to a prior state. You are not repaired. You are remade. And the question is not whether the remade version of you will be whole or broken. The question is what kind of wholeness you are willing to risk and what kind of brokenness you are willing to accept as the price of being open to something real. June is not at the beginning of this film close to love. She is close to the specific vulnerability that genuine love requires. She can be present, she can be warm, she can engage, but to be truly open, to let someone see not just the version of herself that she can manage, but the version that she actually is underneath the management, That is the risk she's not yet able to take, and what the film traces through the architecture of its love triangle is the specific journey of a young woman learning to take that risk again, not because someone tells her to, not because the right person arrives and magically unlocks what was closed, but because life, in its persistent, indifferent, beautiful way, keeps offering her the choice. And eventually, the cost of refusing the choice becomes greater than the cost of accepting it. This is not a new theme in romantic storytelling, but the best versions of a familiar theme are the ones that approach it with enough specificity that it feels new, that find the precise emotional coordinates of this particular person in this particular situation and render them with enough detail and enough care that the universal is reached through the specific rather than despite it. And here is where the film does something genuinely worth noting. It approaches the theme of grief and reopening not through dramatic revelation but through accumulation. June does not have a single moment of breakthrough. She has a series of small moments, each one slightly further open than the last, each one costing her slightly more than the previous one, and giving her slightly more in return. And that accumulative quality, that insistence on the gradual, the incremental, the honest slowness of how people actually change, is what gives the film's emotional arc its authenticity. The love triangle in this reading is not really about two boys. It is about two versions of how June might heal. Will represents healing through safety, through the gradual reconstruction of trust in a world that has proven itself capable of taking things away without warning. A love with will be a love built on the premise that the best protection against loss is to choose carefully, to choose what is stable, to choose the person least likely to suppress you with a specific kind of damage that you cannot defend against. There is nothing contemptible in that. It is a completely human response to the experience of loss. It is, in fact, what most people do most of the time after they have been genuinely hurt. James represents healing through truth, through the decision to stop managing and start feeling, through the willingness to be seen by someone who insists on seeing you, through the recognition that genuine intimacy requires genuine risk, and that a love built on comfortable distance is not really a love at all. A love with James would be a love built on the premise that openness, with all its terror and all its exposure, is the only way back to yourself after loss has taken your sense of self along with the person you lost. That is a more difficult healing. It is less comfortable. It is less guaranteed. But it is, in the film's emotional logic, the more truthful path. And here is what makes the film's thematic core genuinely resonant. It does not present this as a simple binary between cowardice and courage. It presents both paths as understandable. It presents both the impulse toward safety and the impulse toward truth as legitimate responses to the same pain, and it trusts the audience to hold that complexity without demanding that the film resolve it into a simple moral, which is, in the end, the mark of a story that respects the people it is telling itself to. Let me talk about the symbols the film uses because they are doing real work beneath the surface of the story and they reward the kind of attention that this channel was built to give. Water appears repeatedly in this film, not always literally but as a visual motif, a recurring presence. Fountains in Milan's piazzas, rain on glass, the particular quality of light that water refracts, and what water carries symbolically is not cleansing in any simple sense but transformation. The fact that water changes the shape of the things it touches, slowly, persistently, without force or drama, simply by being present long enough. That is what James does to June, not dramatically, not immediately, but persistently. He is water in her life, and the film's repeated return to water imagery is not decoration. It is the film telling you, in visual language, what the relationship between these two people actually means beneath its surface drama. Glass, as I mentioned when discussing the cinematography, is the film's second major visual symbol. Glass as barrier, glass as the thing that lets you see without letting you feel. Glass as the aesthetic equivalent of the emotional distance Joan has imposed between herself and the world since her brother died. And the film's visual language, those recurring shots of light breaking through glass before it reaches June, those flaming choices that place a window or a doorway between June and the warmth she's moving toward, is a sustained, coherent visual argument about what it means to be visible but quite present, watchful but not quite open. The boxing ring, the clandestine MMA space where James fights, is the film's most overtly symbolic setting, and it is used with more intelligence than you might expect from a film in this genre. What the ring represents is not simply danger, not simply the transgression of social rules, though it is those things. What it represents is the one place in James's life where everything is exactly as it appears. In a world built on curated surfaces, on the performance of identity, on the management of impression, the ring is the place where truth is enforced by circumstance. You cannot pretend to be stronger than you are. You cannot manage your way through damage. You either stand or you fall, and the result is entirely a product of what you actually are, not what you have been able to construct. For a character who is otherwise defined by the gap between his surface and his reality, the ring is the one space where that gap collapses. And his presence there tells you, if you are paying that kind of attention, something essential about what James actually wants, not the fighting itself, but the honesty of it, the relief of a space where the performance stops. This cool Villa Mondragone carries its own symbolic weight, as I've already touched upon, but I want to return to it briefly here because, in the context of the film's thematic content, its specific historical identity matters. Villa Mondragon is a place where power has resided for centuries, where the rules of who belongs and who doesn't have been written and rewritten across generations. It is a place that has seen enormous change and maintained the appearance of permanence. And placing these characters, these young people, in the process of becoming who they will be inside that specific architectural shell is a choice that speaks to the film's interest in the relationship between the surfaces we maintain and the realities we contain. The villa's beautiful permanence is a backdrop against which the characters' impermanence, their changeability, their becoming is made visible. They will pass through, the walls will remain, and what they do within those walls will define who they are when they leave. There is also a recurring motif of arrival and departure, of thresholds, doorways, the moment before entry and the moment just after exit, that traces June's emotional journey in spatial terms. At the beginning of the film, she approaches thresholds with hesitation, pausing before she crosses them, as though the act of entering a new space is something that needs to be survived rather than simply done. By the film's final sequences, that quality of hesitation has changed, not disappeared. June does not become someone who moves through the world without caution, but she has learned to cross the threshold, to commit to the entry, to stop standing in the space between outside and inside and simply enter the room. That spatial transformation, subtle, almost invisible if you are not looking for it, is one of the film's most beautifully constructed pieces of visual storytelling. What does all of this say, taken together, about the human experience? Here is what I keep returning to. Love Me is a film about the relationship between grief and permission, about the fact that loss, when we carry it long enough, becomes a kind of prohibition. It forbids us from feeling too much, wanting too much, risking too much, because feeling and wanting and risking are what made the original loss so devastating. The only safe response to having loved something that was then taken from you is to love less, or to love more carefully, or to love in ways that are unlikely to cost you everything again. And yet, the film insists, quietly and persistently and without melodrama, that this is not actually living. It is surviving, and surviving, however necessary in the immediate aftermath of loss, is not sufficient as a permanent condition. At some point, there is no schedule, no deadline, no right time. Permission has to be re-granted, not by someone else, by yourself. That is the most difficult act in the film. And it is the act that the film builds toward with every scene, every symbol, every framing choice and musical cue and close up of a face in the moment before it decides to let something show. That is what this film is really about. and it is a real thing to be about. Let me now move into the cultural moment that this film arrived into, and what that moment tells us about why a story like this one is being told now, and why it found the audience it found. Love Me arrived in February 2026 into a cultural landscape that has been for several years now in the middle of a significant conversation about the nature of young adult storytelling, about who these stories are for, what they owe their audiences, and what it means to adapt beloved online fiction for a screen medium that operates under entirely different constraints and serves a fundamentally different relationship between story and reader. The Wattpad to screen pipeline that Love Me represents is by now an established genre of its own. After the Kissing Booths, Markston Hall, Kalpamaya, the comparison to all of these was made repeatedly in the film's reception, sometimes fairly and sometimes as a way of dismissing it before engaging with it, and what that pipeline represents culturally is something worth taking seriously. It represents the recognition that enormous audiences, primarily but not exclusively young women, have been telling stories to each other on digital platforms for years, finding and nurturing narrative forms that the mainstream industry was not producing for them, creating a body of fiction that is not literary in the traditional sense but is genuine in a different and equally important sense, genuine to the emotional experience of its readers, genuine to the specific texture of how it feels to be young and in the grip of its nice light. The mainstream industry, when it notices this pipeline, tends to approach it with a particular kind of condescension, a willingness to harvest the audience while subtly implying that the source material is less sophisticated than proper literary fiction. And the adaptation decisions that result from that condescension are precisely the adaptation decisions that damage these stories most. The decisions to sand down the interiority, to smooth over the complexity, to make the stories more visually sophisticated and emotionally simpler, which is the exact reverse of what made the source material beloved in the first place. Love Me is not entirely free of this trap. The loss of interiority I described earlier is a consequence, at least in part, of decisions made in the space between page and screen that reflect an incomplete trust in the emotional intelligence of the audience. But and this is where I want to be genuinely fair. It is also a film that takes its source material seriously enough to give it genuine craft, genuine visual ambition, genuine commitment to the emotional truth of its story. That is more than many adaptations in this pipeline have offered. And that relative integrity in the context of how the genre is typically treated is worth acknowledging. Socially and politically, the film reflects several conversations that are genuinely active in the world it arrives into. The question of what it means to carry grief while also being young, while also being expected to be available to experience, to be present in life, to feel the things that youth is supposed to feel, is not merely a personal or psychological question. It is a cultural one. There is, in contemporary discourse around mental health and young people, an increasing recognition that grief, including the kind of quiet, ongoing functional grief that doesn't require hospitalization or crisis intervention, but that nevertheless shapes every day of the person carrying it, deserves acknowledgement and space. Love Me is not a political film about mental health, but it is a film that treats its grieving protagonist with a seriousness and a specificity that reflects the broader cultural shift toward taking that kind of quiet pain seriously rather than expecting it to resolve itself into happiness on a reasonable timeline. The international casting and the multilingual, multicultural texture of the school setting also reflects a cultural moment in which the Europe that young people actually inhabit. Not the Europe of national identity politics, but the Europe of shared languages and mixed heritages and friendships that span borders as easily as they span classrooms, is beginning to appear on screen in a more honest form. The choice to let every actor speak English in their own accent from their own cultural position is an imperfect execution of a genuinely progressive creative philosophy, and that philosophy is worth naming as part of the cultural conversation the film is participating in. Does this film feel timeless or perfectly of its time? Here is my honest answer. The emotional core of this film, grief reopening, the choice between safety and truth in love, is timeless. These are not concerns that belong to 2026 specifically. They are concerns that have belonged to every generation of young people navigating their first serious encounters with loss and desire and the terrifying question of who they are becoming. In that dimension, Love Me, Love Me, Love Me reaches for something that will not date, something that will still speak to an audience in 10 years if the emotional architecture holds. But in its specific execution, the pop fluorescent visual style, the streaming native release strategy, the Wattpad origin, the explicit positioning within the YA romance landscape defined by Maxton Hall and Kulpa Mia, it is also perfectly and specifically of its time. It is a film that could only have been made now for the audience that exists now through the distribution infrastructure that exists now, and that dual quality, timeless in its emotional truth of its moment in its cultural form, is actually a mark of a certain kind of artistic health. The best popular art is always both things at once. It speaks to the permanent human conditions through the specific language of its moment. And love me for all its imperfections, does that more successfully than it has been given credit for. Its influence on cinema and culture is still being written. This film is too recent and its franchise too nascent for definitive claims about its legacy. But what it has already demonstrated, in the conversions it has generated, in the audience loyalty it has cultivated, in the visibility it has given to a specific creative lineage that runs from online fiction through streaming adaptation, is that this kind of story, told with this kind of craft, for this kind of audience, can carry genuine weight. It can mean something beyond its genre category. It can be, for the people it reaches at the right moment in their lives, something they carry with them. And that is not a small thing, that is in fact the whole point. From this moment, we go into full spoilers. If you have not yet seen this film, stop here, go experience it first, and come back. Some things deserve to be felt before they are understood. Still here? Good. Then let's go all the way in. Let me walk you through what this film actually does when it stops holding back. Because the full architecture of Love Me, seen from the inside, from the place where all the foreshadowing lands and all the choices resolve, is a more deliberate and more emotionally intelligent construction than the surface of it suggests. And the only way to see that clearly is to stand inside the ending and look back at where we came from. The first thing the film establishes, with a specificity that matters more than it initially appears, is the naming of June's world. Her full name is June White. Her mother is April. Her brother, the one who died, the one whose absence is the wound beneath everything, was named August. 3 months, three names from the same seasonal family, and the weight of that choice is not decorative. It tells you immediately that this is a story about time, about the months and seasons of a life, about what comes before and what follows after, about the particular cruelty of a calendar that keeps moving even when you are standing still inside your grief. August is gone, but April continues. Undone, positioned between the warmth of spring and the heat of summer, between the mother who keeps living and the brother who stopped, is the film's emotional fulcrum. She is the middle month, the transitional one, the one caught between what was and what could be. Hold that, because the film returns to it at the end, and when it does, the naming resonates as a kind of quiet completion. Now, the love triangle, seen from its full resolution, is significantly more morally complex than the premise initially suggests. The film is careful, perhaps too careful in the view of its harshest critics, to prevent Will from being a simple placeholder, a narrative device to be set aside once James arrives in his full complexity. And what the film does with Will in its second and third acts is the detail that I think the most surface level readings of this film miss entirely. Will spirals. Not quietly, not decorously, not in the polished, controlled way that his sturdier exterior would lead you to expect. He genuinely unravels when he becomes aware, gradually, then suddenly, with the specific devastation of someone who had chosen not to see what was in front of him, of the depth of what is developing between June and James. The film allows Bill's pain to be real, visible, and without easy redemption. He becomes possessive in ways that are uncomfortable to watch. He makes choices that are not the choices of the good, reliable, safe person he has been presenting himself as. And at his lowest point, in a scene that the film handles with more care and more gravity than the genre usually affords to this kind of moment, Will comes terrifyingly close to harming himself, nearly overdosing on pills in a sequence that is rendered without melodrama, without cinematic glamour, in the specific, frightening quiet of genuine crisis. Think about what that means for the emotional architecture of the love triangle. The film is not simply saying, choose the complicated one because the safe one was never real. It is saying something considerably more unsettling than that. It is saying the safe one was real. His pain is real. His pain is real. The cost of June's heart moving toward James is a cost that will pay in ways she never anticipated and never intended, and the film refuses to let June or the audience be comfortable about that. There is no version of June's choice that is without damage to someone she genuinely cares about. And that refusal of comfort, that insistence on the actual weight of the emotional decisions being made, is what gives the film's third act its genuine moral seriousness. Now let's talk about Austen. Because Austen is where the film's thriller dimension, its plot machinery, intersects most directly with its emotional content, and understanding that intersection is the key to understanding why the climax works as well as it does. James's stepfather and MMA trainer Austen has been present in the background of the story since early in the film, a figure of authority and pressure in James's hidden underground life, characterized initially as simply the person who keeps James connected to the fights. What the film gradually reveals as the second act deepens is something considerably darker. Austen has been doping James, administering steroids without James's full understanding or consent in order to guarantee wins in the underground fights. James's victories are not purely his own. They have been chemically manufactured for Austen's financial benefit, and James, who has built his identity in part on the brutal, unmediated honesty of physical combat, on the ring as the one space where nothing is falsified, has been falsified from the inside without knowing it. This reveal is one of the film's most emotionally intelligent plot choices because it recontextualizes everything we have understood about James's relationship to the fights. His presence in the ring was, as I argued in an earlier part of this essay, about the relief of a space where performance stops. And now the film tells us even that space was a performance manufactured by someone else's agenda. There is nowhere James has been able to be entirely real. Not in the school where he performs defiance, not in the ring where he performs strength, not even in his own body, which has been altered by a substance administered for someone else's profit. The only place James has been real is in the specific, uncomfortable, friction filled space of his connection with June. And that knowledge that she is the only authentic experience he has makes the film's climax something considerably more than a dramatic action sequence. When June urges James to stop taking the drugs, when she becomes the first person in his life to insist that the manufactured version of him is not the version worth fighting for, James complies. And in complying, he removes himself as a reliable financial asset for Austen. He becomes, in Austen's calculation, a liability, a lucent, a problem. Austen's response is to do what people who have built their power on exploitation always do. When the exploitation is threatened, he escalates. He identifies the most effective tool at his disposal for removing James from the equation, and that tool, with terrible precise cruelty, is Will. Will who is already unraveling. Will who is already in a place of pain and betrayal and diminished judgment. Austen manipulates Will into agreeing to fight James in a clandestine match, not as a competitive bout, but as an arranged conclusion. A match designed in Austen's construction to end not with a winner and a loser, but with James not getting up. What this does to the film's emotional triangle is devastating in the best possible sense. Because Will, the safe choice, the reliable boy, the person June chose for comfort, is now, through the alchemy of his own pain and Austen's manipulation, the physical instrument of the danger that threatens James. The triangle that seemed to be about love is now in its most extreme form about life and death, and June is at the center of it, with incomplete information, watching the situation converge toward a point she cannot yet fully see. The sequence that follows is the film's most kinetic and most emotionally concentrated. Joan, piecing together the full picture of what Austin has arranged, moves toward the fight with the specific urgency of someone for whom the cost of inaction has finally become unacceptable. She has spent the entire film measuring the risk of feeling, calculating whether the exposure is worth the potential damage, and here, at the climax, the calculation resolves entirely. The risk of feeling is less than the risk of losing him. She crosses that threshold, the one the film has been tracking all along, in its architecture of doorways and barriers and light through glass, and she crosses it without hesitation. Her intervention is not physical in the combat sense. It does not need to be. She triggers the fire alarm. A simple action, the mundane practicality of a fire alarm, that ordinary, institutional, unglamorous mechanism, is what saves James's life, and I find that choice genuinely beautiful because it resists cinematic temptation to give June a heroic action movie moment. What she does is human scale. It is the action of a person who is frightened and determined and working with what she actually has. And what she has is enough. It is exactly enough. The alarm sounds. The fight stops. James is still standing. They all made it out alive. That phrase, which the film returns to in its final emotional processing, carries enormous weight when you understand everything that the climax has constructed. It is not merely a statement of physical survival, it is the film's central emotional resolution, spoken in its most compressed form. They survived something that could have ended them. All of them, James from Austen's engineered violence, Will from the place his pain had taken him, June from the specific closed off existence she had been leading since August died. They all made it out. And making it out together, carrying the full knowledge of what it almost cost, changes the terms of who they are to each other. Will's response to what has happened, to the full truth of James and June's connection, to his own actions, to the convergence of crisis that everyone has just survived, is the film's most unexpected and most quietly powerful emotional beat. He forgives them. Not theatrically, not with the sweeping generosity of a character designed to make the audience feel good. He forgives them in the specific, human, honest way of someone who is still in pain, who does not pretend the pain is gone but who chooses not to be defined by it. He admits with the same precision and honesty that the film has demanded from its central characters throughout that he is not ready for what he and June had begun, that a serious relationship in this moment would add pressure he cannot hold without breaking. He does not ask for June. He releases her gently, carefully, with the dignity of someone who has looked clearly at his own collapse and decided to build differently from what remains. This is the detail that completely reconfigures Will as a character. Every criticism about his underwriting, every concern about the triangle's missing third weight, it is partially answered here in this quiet, undramatic act of honest retreat. Will, in choosing to let go with honesty and grace rather than holding on with damage, becomes the most mature person in the room. And the film, which has been building toward the obvious conclusion of June and James, pauses to genuinely honor that maturity. It does not make Will the obstacle. It makes him a person. At exactly the moment when that matters most, the film's final image, the ending it chooses for itself, the last note of this particular chapter, is one of the most deliberately restrained conclusions you will find in a film of this genre. There is no grand declaration, no cinematically orchestrated kiss in a beautiful Milanese setting, no sweeping music announcing the resolution of the emotional journey in unmistakable terms. What the film gives you instead is two people, June and James, in the space of having stopped pretending, having stopped pushing against each other and toward each other in the exhausting defense heavy dance they have been performing since the film began. They are not yet together in the formal declared sense. They are something quieter and more honest than that. They are, for the first time, genuinely present with each other. The performance has stopped. The glass has been removed from between them and the light they have been watching from a distance. Think about what that means in the context of everything the film has built. June arrived in Milan, carrying grief that made openness feel like danger. She has spent the entire film learning, slowly, incrementally, at real cost, that the danger of openness is survivable, that the experience of loss does not disqualify you from the experience of love. That grief and desire, sharing that hallway I described at the beginning of this essay, can learn to move past each other without one destroying the other, and the ending does not tell you that she has arrived at the other side of that learning. It tells you that she has taken the step that makes the journey possible. The ending is not completion, it is permission, self granted, genuinely earned, quietly extraordinary. And here is the foreshadowing that only becomes visible after you have seen the ending. Think back to the opening frames of this film, to the way June stands in threshold spaces, pausing before entry, measuring the risk of each new room. Think about the glass, the filtered light, the distance the film keeps placing between her and want. Think about the MMA ring, the place where James sought truth, and the way the film keeps pulling June toward it despite everything her instincts tell her. The entire visual vocabulary of the film is a preparation for its ending. The architectural journey from outside to inside, from light through glass to light direct, from standing at the threshold to crossing it, that journey is the film's narrative, told not in words but in space and position, and the specific geometry of how one person relates to another within a frame. What you notice on second viewing, and this is a film that genuinely rewards second viewing, is how early the camera begins to treat June and James as belonging to the same visual field. Long before the story has caught up to the emotional logic, the cinematography is already telling you where this is going. The frames they share are constructed differently from the frames June shares with Will. There is a different quality of space between them, not proximity, not distance, but a specific tension. A visual judge that the camera keeps returning to as though drawn by something it cannot quite explain. On first viewing, it reads as the electricity of conflict. On second viewing, it reads as recognition. Two people in the same frame, seen by a camera that knows what they don't yet know about themselves. There is no post credits scene in Love Me, Love Me. The film does not use that mechanism, and the choice is significant. Because what a post credits scene would do is make the continuation explicit, would signal in the conventional language of franchise cinema that more is coming, and here is the first glimpse of it. The film chooses instead to let its ending breathe in its own space, to let the unresolved become genuinely unresolved rather than immediately tethered to what follows. It trusts the ending to be enough as an ending, even knowing, as the creative team knows, that this story continues. And knowing what follows from the novel series gives the film's restraint a poignant quality. The books tell us that James and June are ultimately each other's story, that the series moves through more loss, more distance, more deliberate separation before it arrives at the place where they finally stop running. The film's ending, in that larger context, is not the conclusion of the journey. It is the moment when the journey genuinely begins. When June and James stop being two people in orbit around each other and start being two people choosing consciously to move toward rather than away. That is the ending the film earns, not the ending of a love story, the beginning of one. And there is something genuinely, quietly rare about a film that understands the difference. My emotional reaction to how it all closes is honestly a kind of grateful surprise. I came in, as I described early in this essay, with calibrated expectations. Expected to be entertained and then to release the film gently. What I was not expecting was to sit in the final minutes with the specific feeling of something having been genuinely said. Something about relationship between grief and permission, between loss and the willingness to risk feeling again, between the impulse to stand at the threshold and the act of crossing it. The film said it, not in any single line of dialogue, not in any one performance, but in the accumulated weight of all its choices, arriving at a conclusion that is quite enough and true enough and earned enough to feel, in the moment of it, like something that matters. That is not a small thing. In the landscape of what this film could have been, what films in this genre so often settle for being, it is actually quite large. Let me step away from the analysis now. Let me set down the frameworks and the structural observations and the thematic arguments and speak to you simply as a person who watched this film and felt something. Because that is, in the end, what this channel has always been about. Not just what a film means, but what it leaves behind in the person who encountered it. And what love me left behind in me is something I did not predict and have not been able to fully set aside. The single moment I keep returning to, the one that has not left me since my first viewing, and becomes more quietly powerful each time I think about it, is not the climax. It is not the fire alarm, not the confrontation with Austin, not the final scene between June and James. It is that early quiet scene I described when talking about Mia Jenkins's performance, the one where June is alone in her room in Milan, where she sits with the absence of her brother and does not cry, does not speak, does not perform grief in any of the ways that cinema usually asks grief to perform itself. She simply exists inside it. 40 seconds of a young woman being honest in private with a specific shape of a loss that has no resolution. I keep returning to that moment because it is the truest thing in the film. It is the moment before all the narrative machinery engages, before the school and the love triangle and the secrets and the stakes. It is just a person sitting with what is real, and everything that follows, all the movement and friction and beauty and complication of the next 95 minutes, is the film's argument for why that person deserves to feel something again, for why the 40 seconds of sitting in honest grief is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of one. Did this film change how I see something? Yes. Modestly, genuinely, without drama. It reminded me of something I think most of us know, but do not always hold on to, that grief does not disqualify you from desire, that carrying loss does not mean you have surrendered your right to feel the things that make loss possible in the first place, that the vulnerability which opened you to being hurt is the same vulnerability that opens you to being loved. You cannot close one without closing the other, and attempt to close one while keeping the other. The project of being available to warmth while being protected from damage is not protection. It is just a slower, quieter kind of loneliness. The film gave me that reminder in the specific, embodied way that only cinema can, not as an idea to be considered, but as a feeling to be inhabited. And feelings, unlike ideas, have a way of persisting after the argument has been set aside. Would I return to this film? Yes. Not immediately, and not with the same eyes each time. There is a version of this film I would return to in the specific state of having recently lost something, because I think it would say something true and useful and gently insistent in that state. There is another version I would return to simply for the pleasure of watching Mia Jenkins' work, of watching Milan in that heightened, slightly too vivid visual language that makes the city feel like a painting you could walk inside. And there is a third version I would return to as a student of the specific craft challenge of adapting beloved fiction, because the places where this film succeeds and the places where it falls short are both instructive, both honest, both worth revisiting with fresh attention. Who will carry this film with them? I think the people who carry it most deeply will be the people who recognize June from the inside. Not because they have lost a brother necessarily, though some will have, and for them this film will have a particular personal resonance that no review can fully account for, but because they recognize the specific emotional condition of being in the aftermath of something that cost them more than they expected, the condition of being technically present, functionally forward moving, and yet somehow still standing at the threshold, still measuring the risk, still carrying the weight of what was taken. Those people, and there are more of them than you might think, in any given room, in any given streaming audience on a February evening, will find something in this film that speaks directly to where they actually are. And that direct personal recognition is worth more than all the craft assessments in the world. Now let me give you the complete picture. The full, honest experience of Love Me, distilled into the truest things I can say about it. This is a film that is better than its category. That is the first true thing. It arrives wearing the clothing of a genre product. Why a romance? What bad adaptation? Valentine's Day streaming release, and within that clothing, it has assembled something with genuine emotional ambition, real visual intelligence, and a central performance that belongs in a more celebrated space than the one it has been given. That gap between the container and the contents is the essential fact of love me, and whether you are likely to love it depends largely on whether you can see past the container. The people who will love this film most deeply are the people who feel cinema rather than simply watch it, the audience this channel was built for. People who are willing to sit with a story that moves slowly in some places and rewards patience, who can recognize craft when it is operating beneath the surface of genre convention, and who bring to a love triangle the understanding that the choice being made is never really just about which person to choose, but about which version of you are willing to become. If you are that kind of viewer, this film has real things to offer you. The people who may not connect with it are those who come to it expecting the full emotional interiority of the source novel. Those 24 million readers whose relationship with Stefania's story was built on intimacy and inner voice and the specific texture of reading alone and feeling wholly understood. The film does not replicate that experience, it cannot, but it can, at its best, produce an experience that is adjacent to it, that occupies similar emotional territory through different means. Whether agency is sufficient will depend on the individual, and I will not pretend otherwise. Should you watch this in cinema, on streaming, or own it? It is a streaming film, native to Prime Video, and it is honestly best encountered in the way it was designed to be encountered, on a screen in a dark room with your full attention, on an evening when you are in the mood to feel something. The pop fluorescent cinematography rewards a large screen if you have access to one. The performances reward the kind of attentive, unhurried viewing that a good home environment can provide. This is not a film that loses much in translation to streaming. It was made for exactly that encounter. And the rating. My honest, personal, fully considered verdict on Love Me is 8 out of 10. Here is the one true sentence that earns that number. This is a film that understands grief well enough to know that the most courageous act available to a person who is still carrying it is simply to cross the threshold. And it builds every frame, every image, every quiet close up and filtered shaft of light toward the moment when its protagonist finally does exactly that. 8 out of 10. Not for technical perfection, not for the absence of the weaknesses I named honestly and at length, but for the presence of something real, for the fact that somewhere inside the genre packaging, inside the pop fluorescent beauty and the love triangle mechanics and the Wattpad origin story, a film was made that knows something true about how people survive loss and what it costs them to open again. That knowledge rendered with this quality of care and this quality of performance ends the number genuinely. And now I want to close in the way that only the end of a good film can close, not with a summary, not with a list, but with a single image that holds everything the film is. June White standing at a threshold. The light on the other side is warm, slightly too vivid, slightly more than real. She pauses, as she always does, as she has always does, as she has always done, and feels the specific weight of the choice in front of her. Then she crosses, no fanfare, no swell of music announcing the significance of the moment, just a step, a single quiet, irreversible step from the space of standing still into the space of moving forward, and the door closes gently behind her, and the warmth reaches her, and the film ends. That is what cinema can do when it earns its ending. Not tell you something, show you, make you feel the weight of the threshold in your own chest, make you recognize the choice in your own life, make the 40 seconds of a girl sitting with her grief and the 95 minutes that follow them worth every moment of the time they asked from you. That is, love me, and that is what I keep coming back to. Now, before I let you go, I want to say thank you. Genuinely, simply, without performance. Thank you for being the kind of person who sits with a film essay rather than a star rating. Thank you for caring about the why behind every frame rather than just the what. This channel exists because you exist, because there is an audience for this kind of attention, for this kind of conversation, for the belief that cinema is worth feeling as well as watching. I do not take that lightly, and I never will. If this essay gave you something, a thought, a feeling, a reason to revisit the film or to see it for the first time, please leave that in the comments below. Tell me what you thought of Love Me, Love Me. Tell me whether you are a reader of the novels first or a viewer first and how that shaped your experience. Tell me which moment stayed with you. Tell me if you think James was always the right answer or if the film made you understand Will in a way the genre usually doesn't bother to. These conversations, the ones that happen in the comments that build in the days and weeks after a video goes up, are the reason this channel exists. And I read everyone. If you have not yet subscribed to the Cineflux and this kind of cinema conversation is the kind you want more of in your life, the subscribe button is right there. It costs you nothing and it means more than you know. What I'm working on next is something I have been quietly building for a while, a deep essay on a film that deals with loss in an entirely different register, one that I think sits in conversation with what Love Me was reaching toward in its quieter moments. I will not say more than that yet. But if grief and the films that understand it are a territory you want to explore with me, stay close. That is the Cineflux. I will see you in the next one.